I am happy to introduce Dr. Daniel Dombrowski as the moderator for this session. He is a professor of philosophy at Seattle University. Among his 22, maybe, 23 now, Dan? 23 books are Rethinking the Ontological Argument, Contemporary Athletics and Ancient Greek Ideals, Process Thought and Political Liberalism, and recently Process Mysticism. He's the editor of the journal Process Studies, which we've all benefited from for a number of years, and he's the past president of the Metaphysical Society of America. And today he's going to be moderating our session on power, peace, and politics and process. Please welcome Dan Dombrowski.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the two Andrews and whoever else is responsible for this conference. Anybody who's ever put on a conference, you know how difficult it is, and so it's really, really wonderful work you're doing. So our first speaker in this session is Stephanie Erev, and Stephanie is a political theorist drawn to the themes of democratic pluralism, anti-imperialism, ecofeminism, vital materiality, and the more than human. Her work engages such themes from a perspective informed by the tradition of process philosophy, and it frequently draws on the life sciences and arts to enrich its political investigations. Erev is an assistant professor of political science at Portland State University, but currently on leave from Portland State, working in Copenhagen on a 2-year project, Vital Politics, Rethinking Normativity in the Anthropocene. So Stephanie's paper today is Process, Ecology, and Political Subjectivity.
Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. No, you cannot. How about now? Thanks. Okay. I'm going to just dive right in. My question is as follows. What would a climate politics look like that did not begin from a bifurcation of nature? Spoiler, my answer is right there in my title, but I'll come back to that later. Having been circling this question, which is a very urgent question, for the past couple of years, I've come to believe that in order to mount a compelling response to it, it's necessary to experiment with novel methods of critique. For critique is today so closely associated with politics that methods other than critique tend frequently to be overlooked or disregarded as not political, or worse, to be derided for being, or so it is claimed, supportive of the status quo. But critique, I submit, finds itself at an impasse when it approaches the awful problem of ecological ruin and associated task of unraveling and depotentializing the habits of thought, feeling, perception, and action that created it. This is because the bifurcation of nature upon which critical theory still rests, predominantly, diminishes our capacity to experience climatic transformations as important, and it thereby innervates the action, the politics, critique is meant to spark. This paper is part of a larger project which draws process philosophy into conversation with sympathetic works in ecofeminism, decolonial theory, and affect theory in an effort to vitalize critique, to infuse practices of critique, as Bruno Latour might say, with a vital spirit, doing so that climatic processes can be experienced and understood as participants in the making, unmaking, and remaking of value, aim, interest, power, will, as participants, that is, in politics. Before I continue, I want to emphasize, and this is important, because it doesn't come through so clearly in the rest of the talk, that my interest is not in giving a critique of critique, or not, at least it's not only that, I do sort of end up doing that. Critical theory is utterly indispensable today. Even if we devoted this entire conference to it, we wouldn't have time to talk about all the reasons why we need critical theory today. And I use it in my own research. So that's not the goal. The interest, rather, is in issuing an appeal to critical theorists to take seriously as political practices they might more readily classify as artistic or experimental. Specifically, that methods of retuning experience of what I will later describe as work thought performs on itself, which I take from Michel Foucault, credibly can be understood as critical methods, as practices of critique. The effort, then, undertaken in this paper to recall something said yesterday is to show what a processual natural philosophy can do, in this case, politically. If critique has indeed run out of steam, then political theory did not receive that memo. In the now 20 years since publication of Bruno Latour's famous essay, Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam?, the influence and esteem enjoyed by critique have only grown. Just last year, for example, New Political Science, which describes itself as the radical section of the American Political Science Association, was rechristened Critical Political Science. Indeed, critique not only radiates intellectual splendor, viewed often, I intimated this a moment ago, as the most or even the only rigorous method of scholarly analysis, it has acquired a certain moral cachet as well. To be radical is now to be critical almost by definition. Now, the reverence for critique within political theory is perhaps unsurprising when you consider that its leading figures situate critique at the heart of politics itself. Thus, Nancy Fraser writes that politics requires a genre of critical theorizing. What sort of critical theorizing, you might ask? Well, she goes on to tell you, a genre of critical theorizing that blends normative argument and empirical sociocultural analysis in a diagnosis of the times. And this, she says, is a fairly typical position, a position regarding the relation of critique to politics, held by Marxists and many others, is and ought, fact and value, not essentially, variously, and ambiguously entwined, but rather in need of being blended. I confess not being quite a Marxist myself, although I do love Marx, that I first encountered Fraser's statement neither in a classroom nor a library, but I'm going to mispronounce this, to cook in, a kitchenette at the University of Copenhagen's Department of Political Science. In need of a break after several hours of writing, I had gone in search of coffee. And lo, someone had had Fraser's words emblazoned on a mug. In his essay on critique, Latour lamented the excessive attachment of philosophers to their coffee mugs. The problem with philosophers, he wrote, is that because their jobs are so hard, they drink a lot of coffee, and thus use in their arguments an inordinate quantity of pots, mugs, and jugs, to which sometimes they might add the occasional rock. Latour was a philosopher himself, of course, but here he was speaking as a scholar of science and technology studies, and his regret was that a certain table of values growing out of the bifurcation of nature, namely a glorification of human-made things over mere natural and technological objects, cultivated within critique a disrespect and a disregard for the agency exercised by non-human actants. And Latour doesn't make this point, but we can, that same table of values inspires or sort of foments a disrespect and disregard for the agency exercised by entire classes of people designated as being closer to lowly nature than to enterprising, fearless culture. A theme, I think, expertly covered by people such as Val Plumwood and Carol Wayne White. Now, bound up with this disrespect, but now on a spiritual register, bifurcation, I read Latour to suggest, with Whitehead before him, fosters a form of nihilism. People have not liked it when I have used this word nihilism to describe the effects that Whitehead and Latour diagnosed, but I am not dissuaded. I think the term captures something essential of the decadent spirit that bifurcation foments, including within critical theory, an effect that was also explored in different ways by Nietzsche in The Will to Power and in the idea of a loss of belief in this world that Gilles Deleuze flirts with in his books on cinema. So I'm sticking to my guns on this one. Back to Latour. He writes, while the Enlightenment profited largely from the disposition of a very powerful descriptive tool, that of matters of fact, which were excellent for debunking a lot of beliefs, powers, and illusions, it found itself totally disarmed once matters of fact in turn were eaten up by the same debunking impetus. Or listen to Whitehead writing in a slightly different key. A scientific realism based on mechanism is conjoined with an unwavering belief in the world of men and of the higher animals as being composed of self-determining organisms. This radical inconsistency at the basis of modern thought accounts for much that is half-hearted and wavering in our civilization. The inconsistency enfeebles thought, Whitehead goes on to say, and has led us to accept superficial orderings from arbitrary standing points. The bare old matter of fact proved useful, here I'll adopt an enlightened vocabulary, in emancipating reason from the yoke of external authority, as, for example, in Kant, in effectively delegitimizing quite a lot of beliefs, powers, and illusions in circulation at the time. But the same impulse to debunk would later, however unwittingly, engender a pervasive suspicion of the real. How then to nurture attachments to this world? But what does this have to do with climate or with critique? As part of my research for this paper, I explored at some length the landscape of what I'll call, unimaginatively, climate critique, by which I mean basically the body of academic literature that brings methods of critical theory, of critique, to the intersection of politics, ethics, and the climate crisis. I undertook this exploration in an effort to understand whether, to what extent, and in what ways the bifurcation of nature Latour identifies at the basis of critique shapes and constrains critical political imaginaries today. I'm afraid I have to sort of speed through this part of the paper, and I won't do justice to the innovative and really important critical theoretical work that's being done. But I do so, I speed through it, sort of run roughshod over it, in order to prioritize a demonstration of what seems to me to be missing across this otherwise quite exciting terrain. My survey, which was expansive but by no means complete, showed that climate critiques tend to set their sights on one or more of three main objects: the structures of fossil fuel capitalism, the knowledges and practices of natural science, and theories, proposals, policies, and programs set forth, whether in the academic literature or in institutional settings, to address and respond to the climate emergencies underway. The field is very varied and diverse, yet across its many sort of different lines of analysis, the role of critique in climate politics actually appears in pretty similar terms. The political efficacy of critique appears to flow from the expose function critique performs. By exposing hidden forces fueling planetary degradation or social injustice, or both, critique on this way of thinking clears a path for action that would upend such forces or neutralize their harmful effects. Thus, Andreas Malm, for example, posits that the interests of the ruling classes and fossil capital have so corrupted official channels of socio-political change that any hope of averting ecological catastrophe rests in bottom-up social movements. He's probably right about that, particularly those engaging in strategic sabotage. Quote, to appeal to the reason and common sense of the ruling classes would evidently be futile, Malm writes, because the commitment to the endless accumulation of capital wins out every time. The climate movement must learn to disrupt business as usual, end quote. Similarly, and despite a different substantive focus, Dylan Asafo prizes critical race theory for its ability to hold climate change law accountable to principles of racial justice. Here, critique exposes forces of what Asafo calls judicial white privilege, which otherwise operate undetected to insulate powerful white actors from the ecological destruction they cause, forcing people of color to bear the brunt of the harms. If we return to Fraser, Malm's critical theoretical approach enables a climate politics to take shape because of the way it offers a diagnosis of the times, combining empirical sociocultural analysis with normative theorizing. It suggests that formal institutions are hopelessly corrupted and argues that in the face of such corruption, there is a need to take matters into our own hands. In Asaffo's analysis, the critical diagnosis combines an account of the ongoing oppressive effects of histories of racial injustice and domination with a program for social transformation. In Asaffo's words, adopting a racial justice framing of climate change enables social movements to effectively change the hearts and minds of lawmakers and inspire them to make meaningful strides in climate mitigation and adaptation for peoples of color at the forefront of climate change's impact. Both, who would argue with either of these programs, right? Certainly, yes, sign me up. I'm on board. Yet, it struck me as I was reading that not one of the climate critiques I encountered had taken climate change itself as an object, had sought to engage with material processes of planetary transformation, melting ice sheets, discombobulating ocean conveyor systems, etc. Instead, critical theory seems largely to restrict its analyses to how climate change has been represented and or caused by human beings, or else to human designs to temper it, reverse it, or circumvent its worst effects. It is as though critical thinking cannot enter into the materiality of climatic change, and thus that the only place for critique to go is into the thinking, which includes the saying and the doing of other people. The general impression, and it is a peculiar impression, at least to me, the general impression one gets is that climate is somehow on the outside or external, even in some cases incidental, to the politics of climate change. Said somewhat differently, critical theory would seem to hold that activities to forge new relations with the non-human world, while they might constitute a techno-scientific project, would not be an ethico-political one. How can this be? If critique is the most or even the only rigorous method of political study, and if it indeed occupies the heart of politics itself, what does it mean for climate politics that climate critique seems to exclude climatic processes from both arms of its reach? We could take up the sort of, why does it see empirical and normative as, but even if we accept this, climatic processes still seem outside. So it seems to apprehend such processes as appropriate objects neither of empirical study, right, leave that to the natural scientists, we do socio-political analysis, nor normative theorizing. For climate, on this view, part of nature is meaningless, is empty in itself. I don't suspect that I need to spend too much time with you all on these points about bifurcation, so I'm going to just say them very briefly. The bifurcation of nature leads to a habitual sequestration of a certain number of qualities. Let's call them intentionality, reflexive consciousness, the sense of value, moral intentions, aesthetic taste, feelings, etc. So a habitual sequestration of these qualities within the interior of the human subject. The concept of nature has become, in Didier Debèze's words, a machine of disqualification, disqualifying all the qualities of things that do not fall within the dimensions attributed to nature, namely mathematical qualities and physical qualities, as if everything else came from superficial dimensions that did not belong to nature, right? Aesthetic sense, moral sense, pleasure, interests, importance, and so on. Nature, according to this inherited conception, is even the opposite of abstraction, which does not come under our constructions, but would impose itself on us beyond the artifices of thought. Nature here is precisely the space outside our abstraction, outside of our reach, outside of our ideas, that space of reality that is independent of the manner in which it is characterized, independent of the ways we link it together, that would fall under the questioning subject, the human subject. So what to do? What traditions of critique are most suitable or amenable to the type of vitalization I referred to earlier, to modes of climate politics not fueled by such machines of disqualification? I turn next to a perhaps unlikely source, the philosophy of Michel Foucault. And I'm gonna have to zoom ahead here too and just give you the essentials, but hopefully that will be enough. Foucault's critical philosophy may seem an unlikely source to draw upon, to vitalize critique, to move climate politics beyond bifurcation for a whole host of valid reasons, none of which I wish to contest. Sort of Foucault's alignment with post-structuralism and certain dualisms that nevertheless remain intact there. But Foucault, as I read him, like his teacher Georges Canguilhem, is also sensitive to what I want to call the vitality or even the material dimension of thinking, to the affective, infra-representational modes of thought which come into absorptive contact with thoughts outside, below the threshold of awareness, or prehension, if you like. And Foucault is alive to the murky and shifting, but irreducible interpenetration of thought and action, and thus to the political efficacy of transforming our modes of thought. Criticism for Foucault is in fact understood as work thought performs on itself. We can't sort of poo-poo the political force of thinking for Foucault, nor dismiss the work of thinking on itself as merely self-involved, disconnected, and even irrelevant to the goings-on of the real world. Thought, he says, is often hidden, but always drives everyday behaviors. There's always a little thought occurring, even in the most stupid institutions. There's always a thought, even in silent habits, or if you prefer, Whitehead, as we think we live. My way into a climate politics beyond bifurcation, and there are many, many different ways, each of which carries with it its own real dangers, is to bring climatic processes into political subjectivity, into thinking, not as determining forces, but as forces of agitation, as unsettling intensities. As agitating forces, climatic processes can now be understood as processes with the potential to energize vital political projects. Yet, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, I've published work on this before. My project here is really to sort of talk about how this kind of thinking and doing politics vitally can be understood as critique. But just to give you the sort of basic sketch, when we write, so understanding climatic processes as forces of agitation allows us to understand them as processes with the potential to energize vital political projects, yet they're not for that reason benign, right, when we understand them affectively in this way. For such unsettling intensities can energize, say, the creation of new, more ecological and egalitarian tables of value, but they can also stoke reactionary fascist modes of resentment politics. What matters is how we receive and relate to these intensities. So again, not as determinants, but as adjutants. What then of critique? Well, critique understood as work thought performs upon itself, when we take this more expansive, affective understanding of thought, is this receiving and responding. It is such a retuning of experience if we undertake that in a deliberate way, when we undertake experimental somatic affective practices to come alive to the climatic transformations within. Climate critique of this sort approaches political subjects not only as agents and patients of the climate emergency, although of course they are those things, but also as sites of material, affective, which is to say climatic transformation. Thank you.